everybody. I have a bit of a mouthful of names, so you can just call me Corey. It's easier that way. So basically, Florida's agricultural water use, Florida agriculture depends very heavily on water. And not only just any water, it needs to be a good, reliable, clean source of water. Of course, when you have continued growth in Florida and continued growth in other competing industries, that kind of starts to make it a little harder for ag to make sure they have a guaranteed source of water. So looking at 2010 Florida water demand, this is actually Water Management District data. So we can compare apples to apples. As you can see, public supply and agricultural self-supply makes up 80% of Florida's water demand. And then when we look at projecting that 2010 supply out to 2030, as you can see, pretty much your agriculture still is seeing a growth of about 5%. 5%. However, that 5% is getting massively overwhelmed by that growth in recreational, public supply, and power generation. So while we are growing, we are kind of seeing that our agricultural slice of the water pie kind of shrinks overall. So because there is that kind of, I guess, a little bit of a conflict with that water resource, agriculture wanted to basically be sure that they still had a seat at the table, that how their requirements for water were being accurately calculated, and that way they could have that, finite source, they can still have it in the future. So the legislature developed a agricultural water supply planning program, which basically requires us to develop water supply projections out a 20-year period. It has to be crop specific. In our case, it is spatially distributed out to look at current future conditions. We're calculating for agriculture, we're a little bit different than public resource and everybody else. We have to calculate an average year demand, so an average weather conditions, and we also have to calculate a dry year demand. And then on top of that, we also have to calculate what's needed for frost freeze protection. So the tricky part with agriculture is, and this sometimes gets a little conflated, is that looking at Florida, and this is a little bit, it's kind of true nationwide, but specifically for Florida, we kind of start to see this decline in overall agricultural acreage. And this is acreage that is for like cattle production, nurseries, crops, or just, dry land farming. Yet, however, even though we're seeing that decline in agricultural acreage, the irrigated acreage is actually remaining very steady. In Florida, it's a little hard to see on this scale, unfortunately, but in Florida, it's actually going up. And the reason why it's going up is this nice little map here from U.S. Geological Survey. There's big changes nationwide, and specifically, it's that drought in the West. That's really a big driver. Even though there's a large amount of water infrastructure out West, a lot of, from the 1950s onwards, most of that federal dollars going into water infrastructure development went out West to develop canals and all that for agriculture. But with the drought, now we're seeing a change of all that industries wanting to come out back east. Because even though there's issues with growing crops in the east as far as just kind of making sure that the soils dry out, you have a steady supply of water, but we're definitely, especially in the North Florida area, seeing a lot of western agricultural business coming into the state. And in the case of North Florida, they are actually converting non-irrigated acreage into irrigated acreage. So a big part of that that's pushing it, of course, is crop price projections. When you can get money the more money you get, the higher that farmer's incentive to put the development and infrastructure in to take that dry land farming into irrigated acreage. So as part of this, for our work with our Florida Statewide Agriculture Irrigation Demand Model, or otherwise we call it FSED, we actually look at farmers' behavior for where they meter usage, and we link that into crop price projections that happened in the past, find that behavioral linkage, and then project it out, of course, based on crop price projections. So as I said earlier, you have that overall ag acreage is declining, but the irrigated agriculture acreage is increasing. But I should note, not only is acreage increasing, but we are seeing growers are switching from 1 or 2 crops a year up to 4, sometimes even 5 crops a year. They're also switching, as was said by John and others, they're kind of switching from less water-intensive crops to more water-intensive crops. So again, even though the agriculture acreage is going down, what ag does have, we are utilizing every inch of it that we can to the fullest maximum. So overall, this is looking at average weather year conditions. Agriculture irrigation alone has 2.1 billion MGD. Cold protection, again, cold protection is not necessarily utilized every year, but it still has to be calculated out. That's about 97 MGD. And then of course livestock and aquaculture rounds everything out. If we're looking at dry weather conditions, that actually bumps on an extra 300 to 400 MGD of water demand. So when we kind of zoom in a little bit across water management districts, we're predicting from 2015 to 2035 a 5% increase in irrigated acreage. However, we are predicting a 17% increase in water demand. And as you can see, it's not evenly distributed throughout the state. So we're actually seeing a lot of South Florida, and it's true that not just growers are coming from California into North Florida, we're actually having growers come from South Florida into North Florida. Just because, again, that crop price issue, they can take advantage of those cropping seasons in South Florida, but then they can hop into North Florida and actually take advantage of different seasons. So they can end up, instead of having these pauses where crops are growing, they can actually just keep producing, keep chugging it out. So for agriculture, what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to take a look at demand. How can we handle demand? So we can try and negate some of the demand by conservation efforts, by irrigation retrofits. We can use our mobile irrigation lab program, which they actually go out and they will do audits of the grower's irrigation system. And using that audit, they can then often take advantage of cost share to help convert from less efficient irrigation systems into more efficient irrigation systems. Sometimes that can even be a conversion from, like, say, overhead irrigation into drip irrigation in some cases. And then, of course, they actually have the option after they get that first retrofit, they can actually go in for a secondary audit from mobile irrigation lab, and just that helps us see how much of a maximization of conservation gains we're able to get. So, again, not only looking at kind of conservation, increasing efficiency, but we can also kind of start to look a little bit at increasing the supply table for ag. And by doing that, we can kind of expand out a little bit from just relying heavily on groundwater or surface water sources, but kind of leaning a little bit into the SB 536 study. We started looking at what's the potential of ag to use stormwater, reclaimed water, things like that. The biggest issue for agriculture with using alternative water supplies, except for groundwater or some surface waters, is of course FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act. And that is still kind of running through the process of rulemaking and all that. But basically it's so that we don't have food illness epidemics. Nobody wants to have Salmonella or Shigella or E. coli 157 in their tomatoes anymore. That was really bad for Florida several years ago. So, but the issue that the feds are actually working very well with our growers, and we're kind of coming to a good agreement. The main issue with food safety concerns is not actually federal regulations or even state regulations. It comes down to the vendors. The vendors pretty much want it that they want a 100% guarantee that if they buy your tomatoes, if they buy your strawberries, if they buy your blueberries, and they send it out to the Walmarts, the Targets, the Publix of the world, they don't want to have a food recall. They don't want to have anybody getting sick. They don't want a Chipotle, which is evidenced by the fact that Chipotle actually had to close their entire line of stores for a day just to clean it up. So it's trying to get better communication with those vendors to understand that, we can test the water, these alternative water supplies are a viable source, and there's no need to have to literally test it every time we irrigate the crop. So as I said earlier, we cooperated with the SB 536 study, and they wanted us to kind of just do a bit of a thought exercise. So we looked at our spatial distribution that we had of agriculture irrigated lands, and they provided us a nice shapefile, point file of all the reclaimed facilities that were capable of producing reclaimed water that agriculture could utilize. And so there's about 3,100 facilities, 3,100 plus facilities, and statewide that are able to provide that amount of water needed. So we kind of looked at different levels, 10 miles, 5 miles, or a mile. 10 miles pretty much, that was the entire agriculture could be met by reclaimed water if so needed. Within 5 miles, out of the 1.8 million acres that are available of irrigated land in Florida, 1.4 million acres of it are within 5 miles of a reclaimed facility. So, of course, we have it nicely broken out by citrus crops that we can actually meet 1.7 billion gallons per day of that demand just off of reclaimed water if we not accounting for if the clean water is tapped out by other users. But of course the issue is that again with vendors, and not just with vendors, but actual folks on the street, they might not like the ick factor of realizing that their crops are irrigated or clean water. So I took a look for us to see let's just kind of zoom out and just look at the non-food related crops. That takes us in the greenhouse nursery, which is actually a very water intensive cropping system in Florida, hay and sod. And that does bump us down to a little bit about 12% of all the ag irrigated acreage, but we're still able to get 261 MGD. And of course, zooming out again further to 1 mile, that drops us down significantly to just 17% of our ag irrigated acreage, or 381 MGD. Again, looking at just the non-ag related cropping, 64 MGD. So there is still some needs that can be met that way. And of course, the biggest issue with utilizing reclaimed water or any of these alternative water supply sources is how reliable is it? Agriculture, we need a steady source of water. Nobody wants to have it, never mind just trying to do crop establishment or watering the crop. You don't want to have it if you're having a frost situation, you turn on that tap, water's not available. And that is the important thing about frost freeze protection is you can't just turn on the sprinkler once, get ice on the crop, and that's it. It has to keep running. The other issue is infrastructure costs. Who's going to pay for the piping to go out there for some of these efforts? It's okay to have a grower use tailwater recovery, or if they can use stormwater storage on their own property, and then they'll do that. But I mean, if you're talking about sorry, I'm trying not to get into too many acronyms. If you're trying to use retention ponds and things like that, who's going to help pipe that into the grower? And of course, who's going to make sure that the water source is actually clean enough to use? And then the final thing, and it's not just for reclaimed water, but also surface water. I was surprised to realize there's some folks that have issues with using that storm water. I guess they're thinking it's running off in your dog's poop and everything. But there's the ick factor to get over. So, it's a little bit faster review. Any questions by anybody?
I'm trying to figure out how to formulate it. I'm concerned from a public policy standpoint with some of what I just saw there.
Okay.
Because I always like to see the business interests use the reclaimed resource when it's available, and you're describing a situation where the business community is turning away from that.
Oh, and this is just in general, this was a thought exercise, and of course there are areas of Central Florida and South Florida that there's going to be, I'm not saying ag has to use reclaimed water, there are probably much more efficient, better users who can utilize it than agriculture.
Do you, here's the question, I think, do you have data on, as ag use is continuing to grow, how many MGD are moving away from reclaimed as a resource and onto groundwater as a resource?
So a lot of our agriculture irrigation that we're seeing an increase of tends to mainly be not in the, I'm calling it infrastructure heavy, and what I mean by that is that, like say the EAA, the Everglades agriculture area, there's been a lot of infrastructure in there. There's not going to be a lot of change. There's also the same point, because there has been so much infrastructure, there's not going to be too much further building out of irrigation. So most of what we're seeing realistically is, they're kind of switching to more cropping, which is causing more agriculture irrigation demand. But most of that's ended up happening in North Florida. And most of that North Florida water resource is coming from groundwater. The big ones that for us so far, we actually contracted with USGS to actually do field level crop field verification for the entire Swanee Basin. Because that right there is the biggest area we're seeing a lot of change. Not only are we seeing folks from South Florida and Central Florida going into the area, but it's also, of course, California. And I mean, to the point that, shoot, I could drive up probably every quarter of the Tallahassee and could point to a parcel that had timber on it, and now suddenly I see a center pivot on there, you're ready to put crops on it. It's happening that fast. And of course, again, just that's that, because they need that reliable, clean source, and especially because the folks that are coming into that Swanee area are out of state, or in some cases they're hedge funds. Berkshire Hathaway actually has bought a parcel, and they're doing a lot of work in there. They want that clean, dependent, reliable source of water, so they're automatically first off going to that groundwater resource.
So kind of expanding on your thought exercise, has there been any thought in, instead of just irrigating, your agricultural crops, working regionally with municipalities to potentially recharge or surcharge an area so that agriculture would have more water to use because the aquifer now is already surcharged with reclaimed water instead of actually taking it directly to the crops. Has there been talk about that?
No, we haven't really gotten into that quite depth of it. Kind of for recharge, are you talking about using an agricultural parcel to help recharge the aquifer? Is that what you're meaning?
Or near enough so that the aquifer is connected so that they could work in conjunction knowing that the water is available, so potentially they can work together to increase water use permit requirements in agriculture by maybe even helping to fund a project, something to that effect.
The biggest issue with that so far is because a lot of folks do propose that. They're like, okay, let's have agriculture. They're going to irrigate a crop, and of course, what doesn't get used percolates down into the aquifer and helps recharge the aquifer. The biggest issue with that is that unfortunately, the more runoff we get, we start to get into violations of the TMDLs and the BMPs. So it becomes a point of, that's why we're trying to register, for my office, we're trying to register as many growers as we can into our BMP program, which basically is trying to say water only when you need to, put in soil moisture monitors and all that to make sure that what you're watering, you're not watering too much so you don't want to have runoff. You also only want to fertilize what you absolutely need. Again, you don't want to get that runoff. So unfortunately, it's kind of we wish we could get into the recharge issue, but if we actually saw anything to have appreciable amounts of recharge, it gets into the violations of possibly how much of the fertilizers and all that are washing out into the aquifer. It's catch-22, unfortunately.
Yeah, Sam first. You mentioned that it's the end product user that is expressing a lot of the concerns. And I know it's
Those vocal concerns are
yeah, and they look back at the liability. Is it the grower's liability? Is it the DOT stormwater pond liability? Is it the utilities liability? How can we combat that ick factor?
The ick factor? Oh boy, that is a good question. That is a very good question. I think that ends up kind of trying to explain to folks. I don't know. There just seems to be that disconnect with there's just a large number of folks that I think even some of the vendors that kind of fall into this idea that somehow it magically ends up in the supermarket. I think people, if they actually went out into a field and saw how agricultural crops are picked, they'd probably be a lot more vigilant about actually making sure they wash that produce before they eat it. Even if, I think for me, I can comfortably say, unless it's bagged lettuce, because I've seen how that gets processed, I wash it. Even celery in a bag, I would wash it, just because it gets packed right in the field. And so, I don't know. It's just trying to educate those folks to that. And the vendors could insist that, like say if you had reclaimed water coming in and the utility could show that the water coming in is it's sanitized, it's good, it's clean to go. There's no TMDLs, there's no fecal coliform problems or anything like that. Those vendors would still probably, just to cover their rear, they probably insist that growers should test that water regularly.
I mean, I've seen and heard from growers of root crops, potatoes, that, like Lay's or whatever, they have concern basically by the plant uptake.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's that concern as well.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of research. I actually, many moons ago when I was a graduate student at UF, I was actually doing some work on, what happens if you water, in my case it was for post-harvest packaging. What's the odds of those fecal coliforms getting into our food crops? Is it a case of just, can those bacteria survive going up the root system, into that vascular system, and into the fruit itself? In that case, it wasn't so much a concern. It ended up being actually most of that post-harvest packaging was the biggest contaminant source, unfortunately. But yeah, just trying to just get everybody educated and on the same page is going to be very difficult.
Well, I don't say this very often, but maybe we should look at California for a use on the agricultural front. Yeah, one place. Some of the most valuable agricultural property in the world is wholly dependent on reclaimed water. So this is not in important communication. I'm very surprised to hear you discussing factors with this sector, but obviously we've missed some communications that we need to pick up on.
Well, I mean, that was like the issue with the large tomato recall, that everybody thought it was Florida. And I think they ended up realizing it was actually a imported crop from Mexico. Was actually what was causing it. But that first but I mean, that decimated the tomato industry for that season. A lot of vendors were just like, no, you need to prove to me that your tomatoes are clean. So it's not so much the ick factor, I guess, for vendors, as it's more just that sheer risk-averse behavior and trying to explain to them, you know. And of course, we're trying, DAX and the agriculture community is trying to show just by growing, and of course our best management practices, and of course having auditors and all that come out, just that, look, we're trying to keep a clean and as sanitary as possible process that we can. And of course it just, you know, it helps engender trust and gets everybody kind of on the same page to where we can realize that we can use these alternative water sources and it's not going to be a safety issue.
Necessarily a model for a solution to that. So.
Well, we should have a leg up on it. If some of the growers are coming from California, then possibly some of them have been exposed to reclaimed water in California, and maybe they can be activists moving forward. And I think it probably comes down to cost, obviously. More reliable supply that's
Yeah, I think a lot of some of the growers we're getting, I think they're more from that Central Valley part of California. I don't think they're as heavily reliant. I think in the case of for that Central Valley portion, they're more heavily reliant on groundwater.
Real brief, there's another resource for you. I sat on a committee about 5 years ago where we selected for the U.S. Department of Ag in their AFRI program, which is the Agriculture, Food, and Research Initiative. There were about 7 projects that looked at recycled water on crop irrigation, and those results should be coming out this year.
Okay.
So that's a resource that may be available for more data.
I'm glad you brought up the ick factor, and I'm glad David brought up California because it is a model for how it's used safely. And it's interesting, you know, across the nation, we're ignorant on water, there's no question about it. But we're also ignorant that reclaimed water is going to be worse quality than taking groundwater and throwing fertilizer and whatever else they throw on these crops. That, you know, it's going to be worse with reclaimed water, and that's the ick. Not, you know, tell me that there are no hormones in all the fertilizers. Everything we see, everything we test, is ubiquitous everywhere now. It's just everywhere.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how really. I think I can maybe even kind of say just in general terms that what comes out of that reclaimed water tap is probably a heck of a lot cleaner than what first came in. Well, originally came in from faucet, so way at the beginning of the process.
Yeah. So I would challenge Ag to help us educate on water and get beyond that.
I think she brought up a good point, though. A lot of where the increase in agriculture is going to be in areas where we don't have reclaimed water available. So it kind of may be a somewhat moot point in trying to capture that 17% increase. I mean, Sewanee, we don't really have wastewater treatment plants, they're separate. So we have to get a little more creative. I mean, maybe stormwater, maybe other kinds of reclaim than the traditional reclaimed water.
Any other questions?
You mentioned the Food Safety Modernization Act, which means it's already codified some things. Is there a significant way to say how that will affect municipalities and other things? Or summarize that?
To summarize the act in general?
We did take a look at it in the process of took a look at it, and the criteria there were less stringent than our criteria for reclaim. So, I don't know about stormwater and the other types of alternative water sources, but for reclaimed water, it was fine. It wasn't conflicts.
Yeah, in general, overall, the new rule has it where, in general, that the water water standards you have for recreational water, that folks, kids go to the pond and play everything, that's about the same standards that can be utilized for agriculture. And of course, you need to have cleaner water sources than that, but that's kind of the standard. Any other questions? everybody.